Wow, what a long day at the Wild Wonder Nature Journaling Conference, day 4. I think I can still count, even though my brain is kind of melting or overflowing, or I can't even come up with the right metaphor to describe the way that my brain feels after another 12-hour day at the Wild Wonder Nature Journaling Conference. I made it to as many classes as I could, and right now I'm going to share those pages with you for those of you who couldn't make it, or for those of you who just need a reminder already. Because do you remember that thing that Jack said about forgetting at the beginning of the week during the teachers conference? There was a little piece about how being reminded of something early on in the curve of forgetting makes a really big difference. Like 18 minutes, I think, was the time after an event that was most useful for memory. And anyways, so I'm going to give you a little recap right now for those of you who were at the conference and for those of you who missed it. I'm also going to remind you about a little special discount code deal with some art supplies. So I'm going to switch over to my document camera here and start you off with my sketch notes from today. So today's day 4, and the challenge today was given at 8 o'clock this morning. I think I had about an hour to prepare today, which is more, maybe I had 2 hours, more than I had to prepare yesterday. And the challenge that Jack gave us was to investigate and enrich in a relationship in nature. So this word relationship has been talked about a lot at the Nature Journaling Conference. And I'm so excited about that because for me personally, the relationships in nature are much more interesting than the individuals on their own. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit. You won't be able to see 2 pages at a time, but you'll be able to see more clearly on each page. I was super excited about that. And the very first class, I knew today was going to be a big day. Every single class I thought was going to be amazing, and I didn't want to miss any of them. The very first class was drawing shiny bugs with Jack. It was a little bit hard, a little bit fast paced. There were several bugs that we were going to draw, and I didn't print out the sheet because I didn't want to use printer paper for my drawing. So I had to draw these quickly from his photo reference and then try to paint them in along with his technique. This is my iridescent beetle. This is supposed to be a milkweed beetle, and he talked about the strategy for painting iridescent bugs. This is something I've struggled with for a long time, but I've only probably tried it like 3 or 4 times. So it'd be really easy for me to just kind of give up and dismiss this technique or sort of be afraid of it. But I have to remember that I've only tried it like 3 times, and this time it still didn't come out that great. But I will work on that more in the future, hopefully. This other beetle came out a lot better, I think. After that was a class with Mike Rhoda, and he is an amazing sketchnote teacher, one of the most well-known sketchnoters, and he has several books, including the Sketchnote Workbook, and I think the first one is just called Sketchnote Handbook. I can't remember off the top of my head, but they're both really good books that talk about sketchnoting, how to use sketchnoting for different things. And I think this is a really great cross-training opportunity for nature journalers. I'm going to do a video in the future where I talk about cross-training, how you can study slightly different but related disciplines to make your nature journaling better. And sketchnoting is definitely one of those. His class today wasn't about sketchnoting, it was about lettering, which is an aspect of sketchnoting, and he gave us these printouts to use. So instead of doing, I only took a few notes in here in my normal nature journal about his talk, because the rest of it I was doing here. And, oh, I'm on the wrong mic. Let me switch. Hopefully this makes my sound better. Sorry for that. I was on the wrong mic. Doing all this conferencing and stuff makes it a little bit harder. Oh, hi, Gene. Gene is here. So here is an example of one of his worksheets that he gave us to print out, and these techniques for typography that I'm going to describe to you right now. So these are sort of his unique
tricks that he's come up with for how to do bubble letters. So I usually do bubble letters like I have a couple ways that I do bubble letters, but usually what I end up doing is I just freehand bubble letters like this. And I use bubble letters a lot in my nature journaling, like almost every page. But this technique, the way that I do it by just drawing the outside, is not so easy. It's harder to predict where the letters are going to be, and it's harder to adapt them. However, because you're building from the outside in. However, the way he teaches is you're building from the inside out. So I'll just show it to you very quickly. But instead of doing the Y the way I did it, you would write out the whole thing. Depending on how much time you have, you would write it slowly or quickly. And then you go back and you actually make these double lines here. You have to think about where it's going to go outside of the lines because you don't necessarily want it to grow downwards because it might interfere with where that lettering is standing. And then from there, you can fill it in. And by doing it this way, you have a couple opportunities to correct things. Whereas if you do it from the outside in, you do not. And then he also shows how to do it in 3 lines, such as this. This one hasn't been filled in yet, and you can get thicker lettering. And his actually comes out with this really cool look. So I actually didn't totally understand this before, but do you see how he has there's these little orange bits inside of the lettering? That's because he did it the way that I just showed you, and it actually leaves those really interesting highlights that makes it characteristic. So I think, improving your lettering can affect your nature journaling for sure. Anyway, so that was a really fun class. And then right after that was a class with Mark Simmons. Mark Simmons is an amazing teacher. I always learn so much and am so entertained. I need to fix his fingers, by the way. They're not supposed to look that like he has some kind of crazy claws. I'm going to go back and try to use whiteout for that. Maybe that was a mistake in my drawing, but I was feeling really bold after his class. His class was about cartooning and how to use cartooning in nature journaling. I've interviewed him on the Nature Journal show before at least one time, and he's talked about this, but it was very fun. He had a new spiffy haircut because COVID has lightened up a little bit in his area, and these were this was the his lesson plan. He was going to talk about how to nature journal a journey, how to capture rendering or rendering used in comics, how to tell a story, and sort of comic style. He talked about, the basic tools that have been used traditionally, and he mentioned these 2 terms being the most important terms as far as cartooning and comics goes: sequential and communication. He mentioned the supplies that he uses specifically, and he apparently is the one who got Jack hooked on the zebra pins. Not this specific one, and not this specific one either, but he supposedly is the one that got Jack hooked on the blue zebra pin, which is really cool because then Jack has since gotten a bunch of other people hooked on it. So it's kind of fun to do the detective work and see who was the originator or how someone learned something from someone else. So it was, he talked about how nature journaling trips are often a journey through space and how you can tell that as a story in your nature journal. So as I was sketchnoting, I tried to show that concept. He talked about how important the establishing shot is in comics, and that in nature journaling, a landscapeito can do that. Then he talked about some of these tricks and techniques for getting the eye to move across the page. And this is something that is essential for sequential art and comics storytelling. And it's not necessarily essential for nature journaling, but we could benefit a lot from it. Our pages could benefit a lot from figuring out ways to connect and move the viewer's eye across the page. So in this diagram, I'm trying to show that this is the viewer's eye and that this is the sequence in which we would want them to move across the page. This is, these are like 3 panels here, 1, 2, 3. And he talked about this idea of bridges and gaps. So in this case, this lizard functions as sort of a bridge between this part of the page and this part of the page. It also goes on to the following page here, a gap between things. So if, for example, these two were all colored in, I should color those in right now to show you. If these were like forested areas, like on a map that were all colored in, that leaves a gap down the middle, and that gap down the middle directs your eye in the way that the artist wants your eye to go. And then you come up here, and then this is a visual element. And here is another visual element. This animal's head is pointing to the right, so your eyes will follow that. And then this brings you back down again. So that was just sort of my attempt to try to capture what he was talking about. Then next, he had a really cool exercise where we had to try to put this into practice. And he also had not drawn this out before, because this is something that he mentioned that is really important, is a lot of times when people, and this applies to Amy Tan's talk as well, but if you have the idea of what the story is or what the plot is, it changes the way you perceive what's around you. If you're open to whatever you see, then then you don't necessarily know what the plot is. Maybe I didn't explain that in the clearest way, but the example that he gave is if he goes out to Nature Journal something about bees and he wants to make a comic about it, if then he's focusing completely on bees and he thinks that he has an idea of where that story is going to go, but then later something else happens in nature, then he has to change the story. So telling your Nature Journal pages as a comic and as a story has its limitations when you are doing it in the field. And that's something that he brought up when I interviewed him on the show. Anyways, here I was using the Fude de Monin pen with the waterproof ink, and I'm really glad because it worked as a really fun and quick way to do this page in one go without having to do pencil underneath or plan too much. And I tried to follow some of his instructions about how the viewer's eyes would kind of move through this piece, including this limited use of color for the California poppies here. And then going back up here, he showed pictures of bumblebees, but then he kept changing the photo really quickly, so there wasn't very much time to draw them. He also said a really funny thing too about spot darks and how these really dark, bold, dark areas is a characteristic of a lot of comic artists, and how he likes using that, and how he also said, I defy atmospheric perspective. I laughed a lot during his class. He's very funny and says lots of funny things, such as, my pens never die of natural causes. That's because he said that he uses microns a lot, like a 0.8. And he said he sometimes goes over his opaque white tool before it's dry, and then he ends up messing up his pen. So I thought that was really funny. Then he also mentioned how he uses cheap paper, and he said, I'm not worthy of moleskin paper. It intimidates me. And then he also said this really funny thing about how he uses color. So what he does is he makes the values really strong with his ink. And he said that the watercolor just plays in the kiddie pool of value. So the watercolor is in this shallow kiddie pool. So his watercolor doesn't show very much value, and he does all the value work with ink. And so I tried to basically do that on this page. I often do the opposite, where I do try to get really strong values in my watercolor. And an example of that, I guess, would be like this, which Jack taught us. And this is using watercolor for all of the value instead of black ink. He mentioned someone in the questions asked what his influences were, and he mentioned Mike Mignola, which I found very affirming because I love Mike Mignola, and he does have a lot of nature elements in some of his comics, such as trees and rocks and stuff like that. So he uses shadows in very interesting ways. So it was cool to hear Mark Simmons mention him. All right, so I'm going to keep going here. I love this thing that he said about how important it is to bring yourself into a cartoon, into your comics. And he said, cartoon yourself. You can parachute onto your pages. So by inserting yourself into your nature journal pages, you can do all of these things that he listed that I can't remember all of them, but one of them is like for being like making funny comments about like what's going on, or like snarky comments, or making little asides. So you can insert yourself in a little drawing on the side of what's happening, like this, and you could be saying something interesting about the weather, or something funny, or something that you notice. So by inserting yourself into your nature journal pages, you can create this voice and this character that's actually really useful for observation purposes, and maybe for connection purposes and relationship, like what a lot of the other people ended up talking about. I think I might have skipped the class today. I'm starting to lose track of which of the classes I've skipped and which ones I haven't. Maybe I did take all of them today, because and there was this amazing, I didn't sketchnote during the Pencil Miles and Chill, but it was super fun. I basically did a lightning round with a bunch of people, a bunch of participants, and it was really fun, sort of ode to the Nature Journal show interviews. And then we had Amy Tan in the afternoon. Some people didn't know that she is a nature journaler in addition to being a best-selling novelist. And she talked about her backyard chronicle, which she's been doing mostly about birds. And she talked a lot about the elements of a story. She has lots of oak trees in her backyard, and she's observed all of these different interactions, and she has a bunch of feeders, and she's paid so much attention that she's learned some of the individuals in this area. So she talked about how paying attention in one spot, you can go a lot deeper, as opposed to, traveling around and nature journaling all over the place, where you might not get to know the individual animals. She's very interested in survival, and the idea that 70% of birds die before adulthood makes their stories actually very interesting and dramatic, especially the juveniles. She talked a lot about the relationships, that sort of web of relationships, even between the rats, the squirrels, the birds, and her, and that how fledglings have interesting stories. She gave a whole bunch of tips on how to find the story, and it was a very interesting talk. After that, there was a Skyscapito class with Beth Ann, and this was really, really fun and really organized, okay? She must have spent a long time preparing for this, because her timing was perfect. She used her time. It's possible it was an accident, but it seems like she had it really well planned out to fit the time that she had perfectly. And we did all of these different exercises that she had previously tested out, which was really fun. However, I think that a lot of the techniques, the watercolor techniques that she used, work better with like really quality watercolor paper texture. But each one of these is a different technique. She also talked about the different types of clouds, but she gave us a whole repertoire of watercolor techniques for different types of skies. She talked about the cyanometer and how you can make your own. It's a thing for measuring blueness of the sky or the ocean. These were all these symbols for the different types of clouds. Actually, these are the symbols. I didn't catch all of them fast enough. These are the abbreviations. They all have a genus name and a species name, kind of like plant and animal binomials. And she shared some of her favorite mixes, and I tried to follow along, experimenting with some of my different watercolors and trying to match what she was doing. So I did a lot of experimentation with that, which was really fun. And then we had an amazing, I think I skipped the, wait, okay. And then I think right after that, there was a little bit of time, like 15-minute break. And then it was time for the keynote. And I should write keynote in here. But this is Dr. Drew Lanham. He's a poet, birder, hunter, teacher, ornithologist, really, really awesome guy that has written a bunch of great stuff. And he has, I think I mentioned him and put a link to one of his videos when I interviewed Timothy Joe. He has, Dr. Drew Lanham has a great video on YouTube. I think it's just called How to Be a Black Birder. And if you're not black, it's a really good thing to watch. If you are black, it's good to watch too. But it just puts in perspective what it's like to be a black man birder in North America today, in the USA today in particular. So that was, and it was a really great talk. It was him and Jack talking, and he talked about sort of his life early on and how he got connected to nature, his root. And he grew up rurally, and he loved birds and animals from an early age. But growing up rurally with like gardening, and growing a lot of their own food, and having two science parents. Both of his parents were science teachers, and he grew up on a farm. So that is a pretty good combination for being connected to nature. He also had a grandma who mentored him in nature early on. And so there's these pivotal people, and you can see this is a common thread of mentorship and pivotal people early on that can really help connect a young person to their passions and really help them grow. So then he had a very pivotal teacher, and a librarian who helped him, get books about birds and fall in love there. Then he also had a friend, Carl, who went to the same school. I think that he said they met in second grade. They both shared birds. They both loved birds, but Carl was a suburban white kid and Drew was a rural black kid. So he mentioned specifically, through some good introspection, that this relationship was pivotal for him, in understanding that he could connect with someone who is different, through their similarities. Then he read an amazing poem called I think it was called The Same Groundhog as Yesterday. I don't know if I don't think it's a published poem, but it was amazing. If you can look it up in the recording of tonight's keynote, that would be great. He had almost everything he said would have been a great quote. One of the things he said was, "The turd thrushes are grim reapers of earthworms." Oh, actually, this was in his poem. But then later, it's like almost everything that he said was quotable. So, for example, later on, when Jack asked him to talk a little bit about this poem, he said this. He said, "There is a rawness to this that resists editing." He was talking about how the poems come out when he's journaling in nature, and that there's a rawness to it that resists editing, and he likes that. Then he had this amazing metaphorical story about a butterfly, a rare butterfly that he'd only seen one time, falling into a pitcher plant in his garden, getting lured into the pitcher plant. He talked about how migratory birds during COVID brought him mentally to another world. So that same scarlet tanager that he saw in his backyard a week earlier was in the Amazon, and who knows what kind of things it was looking at in the Amazon before it flew all the way to his yard during migration. They talked a little bit further about this sort of perilous time that many of us experienced during COVID, where there was depression for a lot of people, and it was very touching how both of them shared during that moment, and very vulnerable. And Jack mentioned how scary that can be for a lot of people in the nature journaling community to incorporate this kind of personal stuff into their journal. Dr. Drew, as a poet primarily in his journaling, is using that a lot. Using that sort of vulnerability is a staple for him, but but John Muir Laws mentioned how he has only recently started incorporating himself into his nature journal. And Drew mentioned how there's a history of bringing that vulnerability and those different elements of humanity into nature journaling. And he mentioned Thoreau and the fact that Thoreau had a lot more sort of political and sort of political critique in his work that has been a little bit washed out in the retellings. He also, one of the things on the same note that he said is he said, think like a scientist, but soften up a bit. So Dr. Lanham is a scientist, but he's also a poet. And so he's able to kind of go back and forth between those areas. And I thought that was really beautiful. He also, I tried to capture this, convey this concept here, but he said that, when he started out with like birding photography, he was really focused on getting like, oops, I should have done that the other way. He was really focused on getting these like close up photos of the birds he was looking at, where you can see, the little rectal bristles and everything that they have around their beak. But more lately, he's trying to get the landscape and the context and sort of zooming out from the bird a lot further. They ended up talking then more about relationships that transcend and what conservation is missing. What is missing from conservation? So he talked about this, which I think is really important. Good thing I took notes here. This is, I think, something that's really important. This is something that is very personal for me, but is important for all of us as we work for a world that is better. But he said, if you see something, say something and do something. So for example, if you experience or you are a witness to a racist act, then or a racist comment, and you don't say anything, then you're basically you're not helping the situation move forward. So it's really important to speak up and to try to do something whenever you can, and not just take the comfortable road. And he said, because this is when Jack asked him, what can the nature journaling community do to try to be inclusive and make things better in the world in terms of racism and all of the lack of access and the systemic racism that makes it so that a Black man in the US can't just go out and nature journal or go out with binoculars birding and feel safe. So it's a big topic, but I'm so proud that the nature journaling community is addressing this right now. It is really, really important. And I know it's easier just to focus on watercolors, and it would be easier for me to just talk about the comics and the birds, but it's really important to talk about this race topic. And I'm really glad that the nature journaling community is talking about it. And then he wasn't done yet. And in the last 5 minutes, he dropped like 3 more major wisdom bombs. One of them was this, just quote it right off of his lips. Everyone has a bird story, even if it is just the chicken they ate last night or the pigeon that pooped on their car. So he is trying to make the environment about what is around you. And he said the definition of the environment is what is around you. So this idea that some nature is better than other, or some birds are cooler than other, can sometimes, or that some plants are more meant to be here than others. Sometimes those ideas that come out of environmentalism and the conservation movement can actually push people away from nature and make them feel like they're being dismissed. So we shouldn't be dismissive of the pigeons. We should try to recognize that, and that he mentioned a lot of the language in conservation is not inclusive. He talked about an experience he had where like a park ranger or a docent or somebody was instructing all of these brown and Black kids about the problems of invasive species, and then having them rip out all of these invasive plants in a way that was just a little bit insensitive in terms of the language, and not really thinking through what they were saying and who they were saying it. And then he also mentioned just this concept that, you know, you need to make sure people's basic needs are met before you tell them about how they need to conserve native pollinators. Making sure that they have a house that is up to standards, you know, for livability, and that they have access to good food, and just open air is really important before you can start telling people why, you know, they need to do things to protect nature. Then anyways, after that, that was wrapped up around 8:15, and then 15 minutes later, it was the after party, sort of backstage conversation. And it was so funny because there was people there playing music. One of them was Ray Bonto. He is 9 years old, or maybe he's 10 now. I interviewed him on the Nature Journal show. He was there playing guitar in his pajamas, and I looked up what time it is in London where he lives. It was 4:32 a.m. in London, and this kid has been up all night learning about nature journaling, practicing nature journaling, listening to this keynote, because he is so pumped up about nature journaling that he stayed up all night long. And just imagine, he's at 4:32 in the morning playing guitar in his room. Imagine his parents. They must be, you know, give them some credit, because letting your kid stay up all night to do Zoom conferences online and then letting him play his guitar at 4:32 in the morning, that is pretty amazing. So that is the recap from today. I literally have one more page left in my nature journal, and this nature journal I started this week at the teacher conference, and I have filled it up already from this this conference. So I'm gonna have to start a new nature journal tomorrow just for one day of conference, which feels kind of weird, but that's how it goes sometimes with journals, and I'm fine with that. One other thing I wanted to mention, in all of my extra free time today, aka my 15-minute breaks between classes, I did start filling in some paint into this micro palette. So this is from arttoolkit.com. Maria Coriel Martin, I don't know if you saw, I interviewed her like a week and a half ago, and she has this amazing company. She's nature journaled and painted on every continent on the planet, including Antarctica, on ice, multiple times on ice. I can't remember. I think she's painted icebergs from helicopters. She's amazing, and she makes these micro palettes, and sells these kits that are really adaptable. Like, all of these are magnetic, so you can take these out and switch them. She has a bunch of strategies on her website and does amazing watercolors with these palettes. And believe it or not, this is actually, oh, I don't have a shirt pocket. This is actually the biggest one that they just started making. So they have several that are smaller, and she has a bunch of cool stuff on her site. And some of you probably saw this already, but she gave us a discount code to use, I think, until the end of this month. So if you put in Marley15, lowercase, you'll get 15% off on anything on her website, arttoolkit.com. I think it's arttoolkit.com. And there's great stuff there, so definitely check it out. I think some people who follow the Nature Journal show already use her stuff, because y'all have told me about it several times. But I just wanted to remind you of that. Just wanted to remind you of that because it's such a great resource. And I'll show you the paints that I'm putting into it. I normally use my John Muir Laws palette, of course, and I've taken this all over the world. Deb is here. She knows that I took this to Tanzania. Deb was there also. Oh, cool. Deb is using them. Awesome, Deb. Is that the one that you've been using for a while? I can't remember what palette you used before. Anyways, I think it's really exciting to try it and experiment every once in a while. I've spent a long time just focusing only on this palette and getting rid of all of my other nature journaling supplies. And so I'm kind of going through a stage again right now where I am experimenting more. So just practice being self-aware and just know that you might go through cycles like that, and there are benefits to both. I'm going to show you, oops, you have to be careful when you first put the watercolor in because it's still wet and it can be messy if you bump into it and get it on your clothes. I'm going to show you some of the watercolors that I'm using are the same ones from my John Muir Laws palette. So these are all Daniel Smith colors. And these, basically what I did is I looked at my John Muir Laws palette, which has all of these colors and quite a bit of paint. And I looked to see which were the ones that were running out, which are the ones that I used most. And then I'm taking those and putting them into the minimalist palette. Then I'm also experimenting with some new colors. These are colors that I got for free from this company right here, Rublev. They make all kinds of paints based on like Renaissance formulas, and they're all pure pigments. And I visited there, it was Lori Wiggum's idea, but on the way to Nature Journal Prescribed Fire like 2 years ago, me, Lori Wiggum, I think Beth and Fiona were there. Or wait, no, Beth and Fiona weren't there. It was just me, John Muir Laws, and Lori Wiggum. We visited the factory where they make this paint. It's in California, and they have all these ground up minerals, and they just make all of their pigments are single pigment. So each paint is made from one single pigment instead of being a mixture of pigments, which is really cool. And they gave us all of these for free, and they're usually super expensive. This company makes the art products that restorationists use at museums when they're trying to repair ancient paintings. They're more well known for their oil paints, which I later learned are really well known, but they also have a watercolor line. So I'm putting some of these in, and I got to experiment with those colors a little bit today, at least the Prussian blue, which was really fun. So expect to see some more of that coming soon. Definitely use that discount code if you want to buy anything from arttoolkit.com. It's really cool that she offered that for us. And I am so tired. I need to go to sleep. So thank you all for tuning in, and I will see you tomorrow at the last day of the Wild Wonder Nature Journaling Conference. If you're not there, you can tune into my recap at the end of the day tomorrow, or watch any of my previous ones about the days that you missed. All right, everybody. Bye. Bye, Jean. Bye, Vea. Bye, Deb. Bye, everyone. Bye, Deborah. Good night.